Final Fantasy VII needs no introduction. Even in a series that has maintained popularity and recognition for over 30 years, 7 stands out among the pack of 15 mainline entries, 3 feature-length films, an anime, and numerous spin-off titles. But why does this game stand out so much in a series that's been going since 1987? Well, this video isn't a detailed answer to that question, so I'll give you my own subjective answer as to why, based on how I felt playing it as a kid. When I played it at the age of maybe 9 or 10, what stood out to me were its memorable characters, excellent storytelling, and Nobuo Uematsu's masterpiece of a soundtrack. Even when sitting in my dad's living room, I felt transported into that world, and it felt like I was taking the epic journey alongside its cast. While it isn't my personal pick for the best in the series, Final Fantasy VII and quite a few Square Enix titles from the PS1 and PS2 eras played a part in shaping what I love about video games. It would be disingenuous and very hyperbolic to say that Final Fantasy VII changed my life in any way, but it's an undeniably important game, and in my opinion, earns the legendary status it has now more than 20 years after its release. I feel like director Tetsudo Nomura doesn't really need an introduction either, but I'll provide a short summary for those who are new to the channel. Tetsudo Nomura is a Japanese video game designer, director, and artist who has worked for Square Enix since 1990. After working on hits such as Final Fantasy V and VI, he got his big break when Sakaguchi and Kitase gave him the task of character designer for 7. After the massive success of that game, Nomura's career skyrocketed and hasn't come down since. Over the years, he's had a hand in multiple games such as Chrono Trigger, Parasite Eve, Xenoblade, and The World Ends With You. Oh yeah, and he plays many key roles, pun intended, in a series called Kingdom Hearts, a fusion of Disney and Final Fantasy. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of that. I may have talked about it on the channel once or twice. Anywho, Nomura is one of the giants of modern-day Square Enix, and his history with the publisher has been turbulent, to say the very least. I highly recommend you guys check out this book called The Legend of Kingdom Hearts if you want to read up on it. No, this isn't a plug or a brand deal. This is just a book that I really love. And it taught me a lot of things that even I didn't know about Kingdom Hearts and Nomura and Square Enix. And it contextualized a lot of the things that have been going on at Square Enix to me for the past 14 years or so. So I highly recommend you guys check out this book if you want a really good deep dive into the history of Kingdom Hearts, Tetsudo Nomura, and Square Enix. Now, Nomura is someone who I've always had a great deal of respect and admiration for. He's, even if I don't necessarily agree with all of his creative choices, he is someone that I have an enormous amount of respect for. He's always been a guy that's kind of marched to the beat of his own drum. And at this point, Nomura isn't just a person to Square Enix. He's a brand. He's a guy that is very recognizable yet enigmatic. And he has quite a large following behind him. And he also is in a unique position to where he can basically just snap his fingers and get almost anything that he wants from his publisher these days. That's how valuable Tetsudo Nomura is. He's been a major player in the JRPG landscape for many years now, and he's such an important person that when it came time to decide who was going to head up Square Enix's next big AAA project, there really wasn't any other choice aside from him, because this wasn't just another AAA project. This was a remake of a game that is considered in some circles to be the greatest game ever made.
To say that Final Fantasy VII Remake has been long requested is the understatement of the century. Ever since Square Enix released a tech demo for the, at the time, upcoming PlayStation 3 that remade the opening of the game in glorious next-gen HD vision, fans have been begging for an actual full-length remake of the classic. But Square Enix, being Square Enix, kept ignoring the request for many years, and it eventually joined the likes of Half-Life 3, Shenmue 3, The Last Guardian, and even in their own Final Fantasy Versus 13 as one of the great white whales of the industry. Now, almost 5 years after it was announced at E3 2015 to thunderous applause, Final Fantasy VII Remake has finally been released to the world. However, even then, this isn't just a simple release. More than likely due to a combination of greed and Nomura's tendencies to expand on things that don't need expanding, this is the first part of a series of Final Fantasy VII remakes. For this opening chapter, it takes place solely in Midgar. What took around 5 hours to play through in the 1997 release has been remade into a full 35-hour Final Fantasy game. So, after all this time, after all this waiting, after all this hype, I can finally answer the big question that everyone far and wide has been asking. What are Razorblade Mango's thoughts on Final Fantasy VII Remake?
It isn't terrible. No, in all seriousness, it's good. It's damn good, actually. I liked it. And that automatically makes it the best Final Fantasy game I've played in almost 20 years. And in a way, it almost soothes the bitter resentment I still have towards Final Fantasy 15. Square Enix actually managed to take the opening act of OG Final Fantasy VII and remake it into a 40-hour RPG with its own dedicated beginning, middle, and end. They actually did it. I'm just amazed it didn't turn out to be this giant fucking mess. You guys gotta remember, too, that I was furious when Square Enix first announced that they were splitting up Final Fantasy VII Remake into multiple parts. Because at the time, I just assumed the worst. And they proved me wrong, and I'm more than willing to admit, I'm happy to admit when Square Enix proves me wrong.
So, this video is mainly going to be a spoiler-filled analysis of the game's story and pacing in the order of the game's events. I'll talk about the other aspects of the game as they relate to the main things I want to cover, however. Now, before we go any further, I want you all to keep two things in mind throughout this review. 1. I'm not a Final Fantasy VII purist. I am more than willing to accept attempts at major changes to the story. In fact, I respect any ambitions to dramatically change the original game, and Remake definitely does that. Whether I end up liking those changes or not is a different matter entirely, but I'm not against the idea. The only things from the original I can see myself being more anal about are the death of Aerith and whatever new composition of One-Winged Angel they're going to do. And spoilers, the new rendition is fucking glorious. The second thing I want you all to keep in mind is that I'm a big sucker for Advent Children. I'm a big fan of Nomura's insane movie sequel to the original Final Fantasy VII. It's visually beautiful and pretty much throws the original game's subtlety out the window in favor of over-the-top spectacle. It's so crazy and so stupid that I love it. Now, with that out of the way, let's get started. Our game opens with the iconic bombing mission, and while there are some small changes here and there, It sticks mostly to the template from the original. It's a great opening to the game, and when I played it for the first time back in March, it eased a few of my worries that I had about the game since its announcement. Namely, the combat. For years, Square Enix has been trying to create a hybrid of the turn-based stuff from the old games and the more hack-and-slash combat from something like Kingdom Hearts. But their results have mostly been unsuccessful. Half of the time it seems like the game was playing itself, or the rest of the time it became an unwieldy mess. But with Remake, I think they finally hit upon a nice middle ground. The game does a really great job of easing you into the flow of combat and gradually encourages you to experiment with different abilities and strategies as the difficulty curve gradually increases. It's a lot of fun. If they were to use this combat system for Final Fantasy XVI, I wouldn't complain. The next chapter is where we're introduced to some big changes. The first is the beefed up presence of main antagonist Sephiroth. Instead of being introduced as a disembodied voice tormenting Cloud, he's revealed in his full glory right from the get-go. And I think, in all honesty, this was a mistake.
Sephiroth is almost too iconic for his own good, because he's one of the things that immediately comes to mind whenever you think about Final Fantasy VII, because one, he looks awesome, and two, he does such horrible fucked up things in the game. One of the things I really liked about how they handle Sephiroth in the original is that we don't really see him a whole lot in the Midgar sequences. He's mysterious. We only hear about him through whispers about how he was the greatest soldier to have ever lived. And when it finally is time to see him, his presence is all the more impactful because of the mysterious things we've heard about him. You get the sense that he is just this overwhelming force of nature. He could just crush you at any point as if you were ants to him. Now, where that becomes a problem in Remake is that Sephiroth really isn't in the opening Midgar stuff all that much, and this game is focused solely on the Midgar sequences. If they were to have stuck to the original script 100%, we would very rarely see Sephiroth. And you can't have that, because Sephiroth is iconic. Sephiroth is too iconic. And you can't just save him for a brief little appearance at the end. He's got to be in there. You got to have him talking to Cloud. You got to have him fighting Cloud in over-the-top anime sequences. And you must have the Nibelheim imagery. You have to. Even if that flashback doesn't happen until after they get out of Midgar, you have to have it in some form. It's too iconic for it not to be there. Like, imagine if Nomura had gone up to his corporate overlords at Square Enix and said, hey guys, look, I don't want to include Sephiroth all that much in this game. I just want to have him be in there just a tiny bit towards the end. Those fuckers would slam their fists onto their desks and go, no, Sephiroth must be in this game. He must be on the cover. He must be in all the trailers. You gotta let people know that Sephiroth is in there. And that doesn't really leave a whole lot of room for subtlety. And Nomura isn't exactly the master of subtlety to begin with.
Sadly, I found his first ever appearance in Remake to be rather underwhelming. The scene just doesn't have the wow factor I think they were going for, and the usage of the expected Nibelheim imagery is utilized in such a sloppy way. There's no real psychological power behind it, because the game commits the cardinal sin of telling and not showing who Sephiroth is as a character and why Cloud fears him so much. For the vast majority of Remake, Sephiroth boils down to scary man with long sword is bad, and I think he deserved better treatment than this. The other big change is the addition of these spectral beings called the Whispers. While it isn't explained until much later what they actually are, they make constant appearances throughout the game, either helping or hindering Cloud and the team. The Whispers have been really divisive among the fan base, but personally, I was indifferent to them throughout most of my playthrough. Maybe I've just been desensitized to Nomura's Deus Ex Machina nonsense over the years, but I didn't think their presence was anywhere near as confusing and egregious as some of the shit Kingdom Hearts has pulled in the past. They were just kind of there. It wasn't until the finale where my opinion of them dramatically changed, but more on that later. Chapter 3 starts with the introduction of Tifa, who is easily one of the highlights of the game. Not only is she fun as hell to kick ass with, she's a great character, and her interactions with Cloud are so much fun to watch. There's a palpable sense that both of them are holding back unspoken thoughts and feelings from one another, and I never once stopped believing that the two had a genuine friendship that's lasted a long time. The voice actors, writers, and animators did a phenomenal job with making these two come across as flesh and blood people who share a powerful friendship. This is also the first time we get to see the Sector 7 slums in all their high detail glory, and god damn, Square Enix went into overdrive making it look pretty. The first time I saw the slums in the daytime, my jaw hit the fucking floor. I was blown away by how visually impressive it was. Unfortunately, that illusion kind of broke for me after exploring for a while. Instead of a living, breathing city, the slums and all the other semi-open areas in the game came across more as dioramas. They're very pretty dioramas, but the illusion of something deeper isn't convincing. It lacks a certain intimacy. In some of my all-time favorite video game towns, such as Radiata City, Los Santos, the atmosphere is just spot on. NPCs have their own schedules they follow throughout the day, and memorable characters and places populate them. These things help towards making these fictional towns feel real and almost like second homes to me. Even with all the beautiful graphics and numerous NPCs hanging around, the areas in FF7 Remake feel hollow. They come across more as scenery on a Disneyland ride than bustling, lived-in places. It doesn't help, too, that there really isn't anything all that compelling to do in these semi-open areas. The biggest offender are the side quests, and, well, I'll let Cloud sum up my thoughts on the side quests.
This sucks. Screw this.
Granted, they aren't as torturous as they were in Final Fantasy XV, but they're designed as if Square Enix programmed a machine to spit out the most generic JRPG side quests imaginable. Kill some rats, kill some monsters halting progress at a factory, find some stupid cats, go kill 5 machines hanging out in a junkyard. You get my point. It's just filler. I know these are optional, but as someone who enjoys completing side quests in an RPG, it was unpleasant getting through them here. By the time I reached the final batch of side quests, I had to force myself to finish them. And I wanted to see if there were any side quests that stood out among the pack that were well written and exciting. I'll admit there are maybe 1 or 2 that felt rewarding, and I'm being a little generous, but you can easily ignore the vast majority of them and not miss anything. Before I move on to Chapter 4, there is one small yet significant story change that I need to point out. After the group returns to 7th Heaven, the bar that Tifa runs, Barrett decides that he doesn't want Cloud for the next bombing job that's coming up, and asks you to leave so they can celebrate. Remember this. It's important for later.
Chapter 4 is the first to have entirely new material, because one of the big differences with Remake is that Square Enix wanted to give a lot more time and development to Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, who are kind of just meh characters in the original. And this portion is dedicated entirely to that. However, it also marks a hard shift in tone that you're either going to love or hate, because Chapter 4 goes full-on Advent Children.
So Chapter 4 has Cloud teaming up with Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge to steal an ID card from Jesse's dying dad that will get them into a Shinra warehouse.
I know, it's fucking stupid. Just go with it.
This in turn gives Jesse an opportunity to steal a different kind of explosive for the next bombing job. But, as predicted, things become a lot more intense. The chapter ends with a really great boss fight against Roche, a new character who is in charge of Shinra's Soldier Bike Squad. He's great. He's such a fun character to watch and go up against. He's brimming with charm, sass, style, and almost gets off on finding a worthy rival in Cloud. I love him. He seems like a character that was pulled straight out of Advent Children, and his insane motorcycle acrobatics when fighting Cloud never failed to make me have this big dumb smile on my face. After defeating Roche, the characters return home victorious and call it a night. However, things go fucking bonkers the next morning. Cloud wakes up to find that a massive swarm of the Whispers are invading the slums. It's unknown at this time why they are flying around and causing havoc, but eventually the group are able to repel them off. Unfortunately, Jesse is injured during the fight and can't join Avalanche on their next bombing mission. Begrudgingly, Barrett calls upon Cloud for his services once more, and Tifa joins them this time.
Now, chapters 5 through 7 is where I started to get really worried about this game. As I've said multiple times already, this game is only about the first 5 to 6 hours of the original game. So, Nomura and his team had to come up with multiple ways to dramatically stretch out the length in order to make this feel like a regular Final Fantasy game. And I'd say the results are mixed. I'm a fan of things like Chapter 4 and some of the stuff that comes later. And then there are situations like Chapters 5 through 7, which... they just take way too damn long to get to the point. Because chapters 5 through 7 make up the entirety of the second bombing mission. I'll put it like this too. When the new stuff in the remake hits the mark, it hits the fucking mark with a bullseye. But, on the other hand, when it trips up, it falls flat on its fucking face.
The story events that took around 20 minutes tops are blown up to 3 chapters that take around 45 minutes to an hour each to finish if you're taking your time with them. That wouldn't be so bad if they were consistently enjoyable, but that's not the case here. Chapter 5 is pretty good, and the boss fight at the end of Chapter 7 is a banger, but Chapter 6 and most of Chapter 7 are so goddamn boring and outstay their welcome to such a large degree that I started dreading that the whole game would be like this. The small corridors and rooms on the way to blow up the reactor back in the day have basically been given their own dedicated chapters. And I get it. Believe me, I get why Square Enix thought they had to do this. I don't envy their job at having to make an entire game out of the opening section of Final Fantasy VII, but I'm sorry, they put themselves in this situation. And I think in certain cases throughout the story, they made the error of assuming that quantity translated to quality. As I've grown older, I've come to appreciate games that are shorter and feature smaller levels with more variety and fun things to do. Are there cases where companies take the fucking piss and release a 5-hour piece of shit for $60? Yes, absolutely. But in the case of Remake, I'm convinced I would have liked this game more as a whole if Square Enix had trimmed a lot of the fat off and made it a 30-hour RPG instead of a 40-hour one. And Chapter 6 is boring, tedious, time-wasting fat. Just a big old glop of it. This is a good hour of content where the game's momentum screeches to a halt. There are no memorable encounters, no standout character moments, and not even a cool boss fight to make the grind feel rewarding. It's just a waste of time. Vapid, tasteless filler. At this point in the game on my first playthrough, I remember saying out loud, If the rest of the new expanded content is as fucking boring as this game is in deep shit. Levels like this just absolutely kill the pacing of the game. And pacing is what Square Enix should have worried about more than length. Thankfully, this section of the game is the worst it gets. But it's one of those levels that should have been cut. I don't think the game would have lost anything if Square Enix had combined all 3 of these chapters into a single level ending with the fight against the Airbuster. Quite the contrary, it would have made the game better. So, as anyone can see coming a mile away, Shinra has set up this bombing run as a trap for our party, and Heidegger, who remains a goofy-ass villain even in this version, unleashes the Airbuster to kill them. After defeating the Airbuster, the party is separated by an explosion, and Cloud falls. He falls, and falls, and falls, until he's awoken by a familiar face.
Maybe you're not okay.
Alright, part 2. Here is where we're going to go over some of the very best this game has to offer. In a way, I see it as a reward for the developers acknowledging our patience getting through chapters 5 through 7. It's almost if Tetsuya Nomura kind of comes out and goes, hey guys, look, please don't quit the game. We promise it gets better. We promise there's cool stuff. Please don't go. Please. Please, I'm Tetsuya Nomura. Please? And yeah, part 2 of this analysis covers some really cool shit. So, if you have not been spoiled on it already, and don't want to see any further, I offer this one last chance to bail. This is it, just one last chance, because I'm just such a nice person. Unless, of course, you've already seen the last few trailers that Square Enix threw up before launch, which basically spoiled most of the game and most of its surprises. So, if you've already seen the trailers, then, no harm, no foul. Yep. Square Enix sucks at making trailers.
Chapter 8 begins with a reintroduction to one of the most famous heroines in video game history, Aerith. If there's one character this game needed to get 100% right, it's her. She is arguably the heart and soul of Final Fantasy VII, and if they had messed her up, there would be hell to pay. Fortunately, they did not. Square Enix knocked it out of the park with Aerith's transition from spunky, low-polygon ally/love interest to Cloud into a fully realized and much more aggressive, super highly detailed vision of loveliness. In short, like the equally lovable but for different reasons Tifa, she's another big highlight of the game. I instantly felt a connection between her and Cloud after having only 2 conversations with her, and you can totally buy into why Cloud would lower his guard for her. She sees right through his rough exterior, and Cloud knows this. He can't hide from her tender gaze. She's also really headstrong, funny, quick on her feet, and legitimately helpful in combat. And she swears at one point, which I thought was just so adorable.
Ugh.
Easy now.
You worry too much. I'm not some princess who needs to be coddled. Shit.
Their chit-chat is cut short when Reno appears. For those who aren't familiar, Reno is a member of the Turks, a sort of Black Ops unit of Shinra, who seek out potential candidates for Soldier. So, because this is Final Fantasy VII Remake, we get a new boss fight against Reno in the church. And here's where I'm going to gush about something I've been saving for a while now. the boss fights. Almost every single boss fight in this game is at bare minimum really good. I mean, fuck that. Most of them are excellent. When I saw the Scorpion Sentinel fight for the very first time at last year's E3, I was sure that a multi-stage and elaborate set piece like that was only going to occur a handful of times during the game. And I was wrong. I was very, very wrong. Every boss fight, every big story-driven boss fight in this game is given a lot of time and attention to detail, and they go through multiple forms that have their own strengths and weaknesses. It was so much fun going against these bosses and figuring out the best strategies in order to wreck their shit. And they don't skimp on the quantity either. There are around 30 bosses to fight throughout the main campaign, and even when some of them don't hit the high marks set by others, they're still really enjoyable. I can only think of maybe 2 that I didn't particularly care for. In a game with that many mandatory boss fights, that consistency of their quality is staggering. I can't remember the last time I played a game with this many memorable, excellent boss fights. In my opinion, not even highly regarded masterpieces, famous for their boss fights such as Dark Souls, Cuphead, and Shadow of the Colossus, are as consistent as Remake. Even if you usually hate Final Fantasy and all its convoluted anime stuff, I'd still recommend this game just for the stellar boss fights. After kicking the crap out of Reno, Cloud is about to deliver the killing blow when the Whispers intervene and drag Cloud and Aerith away to safety. They protect Aerith from harm as Cloud finds a way for them to escape from the Turks. What follows after their escape is a really sweet and chill sequence where Cloud and Aerith traverse the Sector 5 rooftops and get to know one another. This is the portion of the game where you get to hear Aerith say shit, by the way.
Shit.
I'm never going to get sick of that. Eventually, they arrive in the Sector 5 shantytown where Aerith lives, and she takes Cloud to meet her mother, Elmira.
There you go. That's my house.
It's amazing.
Come on. I'm home.
Hey, baby. Been up to no good? Rude came by.
So, this is my mom, Elmira. And this is Cloud, my bodyguard.
And this moment you're seeing right now is where something really clicked about the game for me. This simple moment of Cloud seeing Aerith's beautiful home for the first time and meeting her mom made me realize something special. Final Fantasy VII Remake was made with a lot of love and care. I know that should be obvious, but it took this sequence for me to really let that sink in. It didn't have the aura of a rushed, messy, and soulless game that went through a turbulent development. Just seeing the beautiful art design of Aerith's home and soaking in the calming atmosphere made it finally click in my brain that I was in safe hands with this game. I also experienced a burst of appreciation for the development team that worked hard to make something like this. This small sequence of Cloud simply walking in a gorgeous environment set my mind at ease that this game was going to turn out to be pretty damn good.
I know some of you watching are probably really tired of me employing Final Fantasy 15 as my personal whipping boy, but I'm gonna keep doing it, so sorry, I guess.
When I played the release version of Final Fantasy 15 back in the day, I could tell a few hours into it that something was wrong. I already knew about the game's rough development cycle years before it launched, but great games with clear artistic visions can still come from that. 15 was not one of them. Rather than the work of a passionate development team, 15 came across as a studio struggling to stitch story ideas and gameplay elements together in ways that didn't work cohesively and lacked a central vision. They rushed it out the door, and it clearly showed. I imagine Remake also went through a very strenuous development cycle, considering it was originally going to be developed by an outside studio until Square Enix brought it in-house, and Nomura was working on it simultaneously with Kingdom Hearts 3, and yet, miraculously, Remake doesn't come across as something that had a development cycle like this. And if I may go a step further, I think Remake has a much stronger and consistent creative vision than Kingdom Hearts 3. Oh yeah, I'm gonna go there. This is coming from a Kingdom Hearts fanboy, but I'm more than willing to admit that I think Remake overall is just a much more cohesive, narratively well thought out game than Kingdom Hearts 3. For me, this simple moment with Cloud and Aerith condenses all the love and care this team put into this remake into one scene. This is one of my absolute favorite moments in the game. It reminds me of why I fell in love with Square Enix's games back in the day. It's pure video game magic. So, after another unfortunate round of dear Jesus Christ, let's get these boring fucking side quests over with, and a kick-ass boss fight against Reno's partner in crime, Rude, Cloud and Aerith return to her home to call it a day. However, Cloud is asked by Elmira to leave in the middle of the night, and he honors her request. But, and we all know Aerith, she cuts Cloud off while he's attempting to leave the town, and insists on showing him the way back to Sector 7. Cloud, having really no choice given Aerith's really strong persistence, allows her to join him on the quest back. And what a quest it is. Actually, it's not all that exciting initially. There are some funny moments with some bandits, but then you get to this. Shit like this makes me want to eject this game from my PS4 and fling it out the fucking window.
Ugh. Dear Jesus Christ in heaven, I will never sin again if you just stop having me play this fucking grain level!
Once that fucking destroyer of precious time on this earth is done, Cloud and Aerith make it to that creepy looking playground from the original game. Seriously, who the hell would want to play on these things? They look like they want to swallow your soul. Before Cloud and Aerith can go back to Sector 7, they happen upon Tifa being led out of the city in a carriage. Cloud and Aerith decide to put off returning to Sector 7 in order to go after Tifa and save her. This leads them to the crime-ridden, lavish, and colorful Sin City known as Wall Market.
Welcome to Wall Market, the pleasure capital of Midgar that's got everything for everybody. Couple, huh? It's all good. Play together, do your own thing, earn a little scratch on the side even. Whatever you're into, we got you. Got a special one-time limited offer.
No, thank you. Come on, Cloud. Let's go.
At first glance, Wall Market is a glorious sight. I've always loved neon-lit, grimy, and disgusting places like this in video games. They just ooze atmosphere and tend to be home to some really memorable moments and spectacular visuals. Similar to the Sector 7 slums, I was struck by how cool it looked. Also similar to Sector 7 slums, the vibe of it being a diorama hit me almost less than a minute. Something like Fallout New Vegas is almost 10 years old, and I think what they did with Freeside and the Strip is way more evocative and lively than what we see in Final Fantasy VII Remake. I got a lot more out of exploring Freeside. I got a much bigger kill or be killed gangster vibe from it than I did with Wall Market. I guess Square Enix just look as good as this game is. I just don't think Square Enix have it in them to make good semi-open areas in the Final Fantasy series. I'm sorry, guys. And going back to the side quests again, I think they are particularly disappointing in Wall Market. They show promise that we're going to have a wild time navigating the seedy underbelly of the town and engaging in mischievous debauchery. Well, that doesn't happen. Instead, the side quests in the most interesting location in a remake are, once again, boring fetch quests or basic mini-games. The side mission, The Party Never Stops, exemplifies this waste of potential perfectly. It shows you running around town trying to locate an old man's VIP card to the Honeybee Inn. Ooh, now that sounds exciting. Will we get to poke at the dark heart of the criminal underworld to reveal the whereabouts of this man's VIP card? Maybe the old man is lying to you, and something even crazier will happen. If he's telling the truth and we return his card, maybe we will get to see what VIP status within the Honeybee Inn entails. No. Sadly, no. Big fucking no. To all three of those questions. All three of those possibilities get thrown out the fucking window. So, how does this side mission go? Well, it basically boils down to you helping out vendors in very simplistic ways and making deliveries to people you don't care about. And the goal of acquiring that VIP card almost seems like an afterthought by the end of the quest. I was so disheartened when I realized that stuff like this, in such a potentially marvelous location, had to offer absolutely nothing in terms of its side quests. You have this bustling metropolis filled with pretty scenery and colorful characters, and yet I'm stuck running around doing deliveries for merchants and telling a cook that his food is crap because he needs to turn the heat up on his stove. Yay! How enthralling. On a brighter note, Wall Market is home to some of the very best moments and surprises in the game. After Aerith and Cloud get familiar with their new surroundings and are rejected by Don Corneo's henchmen, they make their way to see a woman named Madame M, the owner of a handjob parlor.
Little rough.
They can stop at any time if it's too much to handle.
And one of the big cheeses of Wall Market. They strike a deal that if they win a big tournament for her, she will see to it that they are able to get into Don Corneo's mansion. At first, I was very skeptical when I saw this Coliseum tournament stuff. Unless it's a big theme of the story, I don't usually take kindly to obligatory Coliseum sections. Most of the time, they seem like tiresome padding, and I wasn't going to tolerate any more of that in Remake, considering it already has its fair share of padding. To my great surprise, these Coliseum fights ended up being pretty good. Nothing great, but much better than I was expecting them to be. Well, until the boss fight, of course. And what a boss fight it is. One of the best surprises of the game was the reveal of the Hell House, an enemy I was 100% sure wouldn't be in this remake. I mean, it's a monster that's a fucking literal house. I thought there was no way a stupid looking enemy like that would appear in Remake. But I was wrong again, and I couldn't be happier. I laughed out loud the first time I saw it because I couldn't believe Square Enix had actually transformed it into a force of nature beast of a boss for a fucking Coliseum. Whoever came up with that idea at Square Enix deserves a raise. Hell, they deserve a 2-month paid vacation. After a surprisingly challenging and lengthy fight against it, Cloud and Aerith defeat the Hell House and return to Madame M's parlor. The reward for their hard work in the Coliseum? Aerith gets glammed the fuck up.
Hey, get out of the way! Quit talking! Move it! Move it! Come on! Clear the road!
Yeah.
Cloud?
Excuse me.
However, in order for the both of them to be allowed into Corneo's palace, Cloud also needs to get glammed the fuck up. So, where to start? Well, how about a trip to the Honeybee Inn?
Good evening. Welcome to the entertainment extravaganza that is the Honeybee Inn.
If you've ever played the original Final Fantasy VII and went into the Honeybee Inn, it was memorable, to say the very least. Cloud and Aerith go to the famous club to meet its owner, Andrea Rodea, along with Madame M and a cowboy named Chocobo Sam. He is one of the head honchos of Wall Market under Don Corneo. Fortunately, because of Cloud's stellar performance in the Coliseum, Rodea is more than willing to audition Cloud. And this audition is just okay. So when you go to the Honeybee Inn in the original game, this is what people remember it for. And this is what happens there in Remake. I mean, just look at it. Look at it. It's fucking amazing. This is what I meant when I said that whenever Remake's new content hits the mark, it hits the goddamn bullseye. Hilarious, entertaining shenanigans like this stupid as hell dance sequence are the kind of things I will gladly accept from Remake. Not hours of padding, not hours of side quests that make me want to take a nap, and especially not that fuck-awful crane minigame. This is what I want. And the weirdest thing about it is that it actually would make a decent rhythm game on its own. I enjoyed this sequence far more than anything I've played from those Persona dancing games. If Square Enix were to actually release a rhythm game with these graphics, set in this world, and made some kind of wacky ass story around dancing to save the universe, I'd buy it day one.
Nice moves! I love it!
Honey, I'm in love.
So Cloud dances his ass off and impresses Rodea so much that he's permitted a glam up session. Finally, after battling monsters in a coliseum and dancing like his life depended on it, Cloud looks like a chick and is granted entry into Don Corneo's mansion. There the duo meet up with Tifa, and she explains to them that she's there to get some information from the Don himself about what Shinra's next move against Avalanche will be. However, in order to do this, she needed to audition to be one of Corneo's brides and get close to him. The three are escorted to the Don's office, and thanks to Cloud's really aggressive behavior towards Corneo, he chooses Cloud, of all people, to be his bride for that night. The trio manage to subdue both the Don and his henchmen, and tell him that they'll basically destroy his cock and balls if he doesn't reveal how Shinra plans to retaliate against Avalanche. Faced with the possibility of his dick and testicles being pulverized, he reveals that Shinra plans to destroy their own plate above Sector 7 and use it to crush the slums and anyone living there. The trio are horrified by that possibility, but before they can escape, the Don flips the tables on them and traps them in the sewer. Now, sewer levels are usually the bane of my existence in video games. I never play a game and think, Wow, I can't wait to get to the sewer level. But this one ain't that bad. It continues the streak of high-quality boss fights with one against Corneo's pet monster, Abzu. And navigating the sewer is mostly hassle-free. Well, mostly.
Here goes. Whoops. Try to stay in sync.
Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith manage to escape the sewers and come upon the train graveyard. In the old game, the train graveyard was just some small area that you pass through to reach the next big story beat. However, in Remake, it's been transformed into its own dedicated 2-hour level. If that sounds awful, I'm delighted to say that it isn't. In fact, this was one of my favorite parts of the game, and a shining example of when Remake nails its new material. The train graveyard is just a beautifully realized place. Thanks to a steady diet of Thomas the Tank Engine when I was very young, I've always had a visual soft spot for trains and train stations. Combine that with all the creepy imagery and melancholic atmosphere, I was in a state of pure bliss playing through this level. It's also paced very well compared to a lot of the other original content in this remake. It doesn't come across as a level built out of a need for padding, and it ends just when it starts to grow just a tad tiresome. Much appreciated, guys. Great level. Seriously, great job on this one. The next chapter is where Square Enix cranks up the JRPG drama to 11. It contains the iconic battle where Avalanche has one last stand in order to protect the Sector 7 plate from being dropped. And like a lot of things with Remake, it's greatly expanded upon. This right here is the payoff moment that all the extra time with Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge has been building towards. And we get a really thrilling scene where Aerith runs back to 7th Heaven to rescue Marlene. If the game hadn't already won me over before this point, this chapter would have been the tipping point. It would have sealed the deal at this point. Like I said, it cranks up the drama to 11, and I absolutely loved it. Even with the awkward, weird dialogue at times, and some moments that just don't make any damn sense. This whole amazing set piece had me by the throat, and I didn't want it to let go. Here's a tip for anyone out there who is working on a remake of anything well known. If you put your characters in serious danger, and I'm almost literally on the edge of my seat with excitement and suspense, even though I already know what's going to happen, you have fucking nailed it. I love moments like this where our heroes are racing to stop a devastating thing from happening, and they have to fight with their backs against the wall while simultaneously racing against the clock. It's exciting stuff. I love stuff like this. In the original game, this set piece is still a big dramatic point during the opening segment. However, it works even better as the dramatic low point in Remake. In a traditional 3-act structure, there is always a low point for our protagonists, where they experience hopelessness and must summon up the strength and courage to fight back against an overwhelming antagonist. I think this works particularly well here, because the game has given us a lot more time to enjoy the company of these characters compared to the original. And thus, we actually give a shit when they're suffering and facing a very grim situation. When Biggs and Jesse die in the original, it's kind of just meh, because we don't really know them all that well. Here, their death scenes are so overdramatic and sentimental that I loved it. Jesse's, in particular, is effective. It's a great death scene in its own right, but it also really works as the moment Cloud realizes that he's emotionally invested in this conflict, after being so cold and seemingly indifferent to it throughout the whole game. Spending time with Jesse in Chapter 4 makes this great moment of character development for Cloud all the more believable. I'm also not ashamed to admit that this is the first of 2 moments during this one chapter that actually kinda got me choked up a little bit. When Cloud says that now memed to hell line,
You owe me a pizza.
I laughed out loud at how awkward it was, while also being stunned at how sincere it felt. It reminded me a lot of the stilted voice acting of my favorite Final Fantasy game, 10. Clumsy, strange, but endearing as hell at the same time. The other scene that got me is a new one featuring Aerith and Marlene. While Cloud and the team are fighting Shinra, Aerith runs to Sector 7 to rescue Marlene from 7th Heaven. When the two meet for the first time, it leads to a wonderful little scene where Aerith has to coax the frightened Marlene out of her hiding spot. I think the reason this one gets me misty-eyed simply has to do with how heartwarming and moving Aerith's efforts to make Marlene feel better in the face of immense danger are. I said earlier that Square Enix nailed this version of Aerith, and a scene like this that showcases her sensitivity, strength, and warmth makes for some compelling evidence to that opinion. What makes this scene even more intriguing is that Marlene can sense there is something special about Aerith. In typical Nomura fashion, he keeps that plot revelation close to the chest for now, but for those familiar with the series, it's one of our first clues that Aerith is an ancient. It's a plot point that comes up later, so thankfully, this isn't a Kingdom Hearts situation where we have to wait 3 goddamn games to get an answer for a big mystery. Right, Nomura? Nomura? Unfortunately, before Aerith and Marlene can escape, they're intercepted by the leader of the Turks, Shang. Aerith makes a deal with Shang, the guarantee of Marlene's safety in exchange for Aerith handing herself over to Shinra, and it's a deal that the smug bastard happily accepts. Meanwhile, Cloud and the team come upon Reno and Rude attempting to initiate the plate drop that will crush the citizens of Sector 7. Considering they want some payback against Cloud for the ass-kicking he gave them back in the Sector 5 slums, the climax of this level kicks off with another boss fight against the duo. And if I may go on a very, very brief nerd-out moment yet again, oh my fucking god, the boss fight against these guys is so fucking awesome, oh my god! Seriously, whoever had a hand in designing this game's boss fights, you are beautiful, and I love you. After the fight, Tifa attempts to deactivate the plate drop, and she's almost successful, until Rude rushes in to stop her. In a bizarre twist, the Whispers reappear and prevent Cloud and Barrett from helping Tifa. Unfortunately, Rude manages to activate the plate drop and escape with an unconscious Reno. Devastated, the team tries to stop the plate drop, but it's too late. To rub salt in the wound, Shang appears on a video screen and informs them that not only is it impossible to disable the plate drop, but he has captured Aerith. Faced with very little time left, Cloud, Barrett, and Tifa escape from the platform via a zipline. This leads to one of the most iconic shots from the opening of the original game, and I can't even imagine how much time and money went into animating this sequence alone. It's breathtaking. As an added bonus, we get our first appearance of Cait Sith, who will no doubt play a much bigger role in the next game. Nice. But alas, Sector 7 is completely wiped out, and the party is at their lowest point. In a 3-act structure of any traditional narrative, this is the low point before the 3rd act. Their home has been destroyed. Barrett's beloved daughter is still out there somewhere. Tifa is an emotional wreck, and Aerith has been captured by the Turks. There can be no debate in this situation. Shinra scored a major victory against our heroes.
Okay, part 3. So usually when it comes to recording these live action bits, I have some kind of script in front of me because there's something really specific I want to say in order to introduce whatever part that I'm on in these videos or whatever chapter. But I don't in this case. I mainly want to make this live action part, introducing part 3, as a thank you to those who have made it this far. So if you have been watching this whole thing without any eruptions, and especially if you've liked what you've seen so far and want to keep going, thank you. This video took a very long time to make, I poured a lot of love and care into it, and I hope you all are enjoying it. And again, thank you for giving it the time of day in the first place. It means a lot to me. So, without further ado, let's get into the third act of Final Fantasy VII Remake.
After the initial shock of Sector 7's obliteration wears off, Cloud and Tifa inform Barret that Aerith had rescued Marlene before the plate fell. Naturally, they assume Marlene is in the safest place Aerith could think of, home. On their way to Elmira's house, the party walks through the remnants of the destruction and get an idea of how devastating this event was for its citizens who survived. As I said previously, most of the world in this game feels like a diorama, especially the open world stuff. Just blank, boring people standing there who are only meant to be mere illusions of a larger world as you pass by them and never think about them again. However, in this case, where you're passing by them and hearing their cries of despair and woe after their homes have been destroyed, the illusion of a displaced community in crisis is actually pretty damn convincing. I think it works better than the other times you encounter civilians here, because you only pass by them once and never see them again. Therefore, the illusion remains intact and isn't at risk to break due to repeated exposure. The party also discussed the possibility of Aerith being an ancient, which is something that Shang let slip in his final fuck you message to them back on the plates. Hearing this, Cloud gets another vivid hallucination of Sephiroth, saying crazy shit like,
"Within my veins flows the blood of ancients. This planet is my birthright. You have failed again, I see. But through suffering, you will grow strong. Isn't that what you want?"
Once that moment passes and Cloud regains his composure, the party continues on and eventually reaches Elmira's place. There, the party is finally reunited with Marlene, who is sound asleep after all the excitement from the day. For as much of a hard-ass as Barret was in the first half of the game, it melts your heart when you see him interact with Marlene, and the look on his face when he realizes she's safe is priceless. Small character moments like Barret's animations that reflect his relief and stunned joy at seeing his beloved daughter alive are when this game's enormous budget is being put to effective use. Certainly more effectively than other Square Enix games I know of. After the party settles down, they begin to discuss Aerith's current situation with Elmira, and this is where we find out much more about Aerith, Elmira, and the circumstances that brought the two together. Years ago, while waiting for her soldier husband to return home, she encountered a young Aerith and her birth mother at the train station. With her dying words, Aerith's mother asked Elmira to take her child somewhere safe, and she honored that request. Elmira and Aerith quickly grew close, but she started to notice strange things about the young girl. For example, how she viewed the world, life, and particularly death. Elmira was further convinced of Aerith's special abilities when she randomly told her one day that her husband had been killed in action days before receiving an official confirmation from the military. After that, Elmira grew even closer to Aerith. However, trouble started coming around when Shang appeared at their door one day and asked for Aerith to come with him due to her status as the last living ancient. And at this point, I'll just let the asshole himself explain what an ancient is.
They were the original stewards of the planet, whose boundless knowledge and wisdom shall guide us to the promised land. Some believe the promised land to be a myth, others an allegory of sorts. But we take the words of the scriptures at face value and believe it to be quite real.
Obviously, because he's a creepy piece of shit who works for Shinra, Aerith firmly rejects his offer. Elmira explains that in order for Shinra to take advantage of her powers, Aerith would have to go there willingly. So that explains why the Turks don't just simply kidnap her. It also explains why Aerith was able to successfully negotiate with Shang when it came to saving Marlene's life. Aerith willingly sacrificed her freedom in exchange for Marlene's safety. Yet another example of why Aerith is such an endearing protagonist. Elmira begs Cloud not to go off to rescue Aerith because she doesn't want to run the risk of Shinra hurting her, or worse. Feeling that they need to give Elmira some breathing room, the party decides to check on what remains of Seventh Heaven. When they arrive, the ruins of Sector 7 look just as bad as they feared, and they eventually find what remains of Seventh Heaven. However, they also find something rather unexpected, one of Wedge's cats. Sensing that the cat is trying to lead them somewhere, the party decides to follow it. The cat leads them to an underground secret Shinra facility, where they find an unconscious Wedge. In typical video game fashion, before they can rescue him, the party is separated by the floor collapsing on them. Barret and Tifa face off against a multitude of enemies as they find a way to reach Wedge. The two eventually come upon the boss of this chapter, the failed experiment. Now, I've gushed multiple times about how the bosses in this game are stellar, and how everyone involved with their design deserves a massive raise and paid vacation. In this case, though, it's not really all that good. There are just a handful of bosses in this game that really aren't that great, and the failed experiment is unfortunately one of them. It's not a bad boss fight by any stretch of the imagination. It's just not all that fun to fight. Maybe if it was just the single big failed experiment, it would be a lot better. But, of course, the asswipe has to summon minions to attack you as well, so yeah, it's just not that good of a fight. After killing the boss, Barret and Tifa are reunited with Cloud, and discover to their horror that the Shinra site experimented with humans. But before they can investigate any further, the Whispers drag them out of the facility. Even though the party successfully saves Wedge, Cloud and Tifa also have to deliver the bad news to Barret that Biggs and Jesse didn't make it out alive.
They've returned to the planet.
They were supposed to return to us. But if we stop now, they'll never let us live it down.
The party takes Wedge back to Elmira for shelter and rest, and call it a day themselves. What follows is a scene where Cloud speaks to one of the three supporting party characters during the night. Depending on a surprisingly enormous number of choices you've made throughout the game up until that point, you get a big character moment with either Barret, Tifa, or Aerith. On my first playthrough, I got Aerith's scene, and I'm really happy I did. It's a great moment where Cloud has a rather intimate conversation with Aerith in a dreamlike version of her garden. The most interesting part of this scene is Aerith warning Cloud not to fall in love with her. For fans who know the story already, it's an eerie premonition of things to come, but it also serves as a vital clue that Aerith knows more about the events of this game than she's letting on. This becomes more important and apparent towards the end of the game as well. As for the others, the Barret scene is fine, and Tifa shares a touching moment with Cloud in hers, but in my opinion, I think Aerith's should have been the only scene. It's far and away the best one, and it gives a lot more context to a line Cloud says the next morning about him feeling like Aerith's calling out to him. By this point, Elmira has accepted that the best course of action is to rescue Aerith from Shinra, and gives Cloud her blessing to do so. After saying goodbye to Elmira and Marlene, the party leaves to begin their rescue attempt. In a more tightly paced game, this is where the momentum would keep going, and immediately thrust the party into the task of acquiring the means to rescue Aerith. But because this is Final Fantasy VII Remake and we need to stretch this baby out to the length of a full Final Fantasy game, this chapter throws quite a bit of story filler at you and asks you to participate in the final round of, oh dear lord, let's get these damn side quests over with. It's almost like the game is saying, alright gang, let's go rescue Aerith. You ready bitches? I'm ready bitches, let's go! But first, would you like to complete a bunch of nebulous side quests? Because Aerith can wait while you guys do pull-ups, unlock fast travel, and fight a secret boss, right? Yeah, right? The final batch of chapters in this game unfortunately have some pesky pacing problems, and the random dump of side quests at the end is one of those times where it could have used some editing. I think it would have been a much smarter choice to save these side quests as things to do after completing the main story. It doesn't make a whole lot of narrative sense for that to be the case, but one, it's a video game, so some suspension of disbelief is not exactly a stretch. And two, it makes even less sense to ask the player to run around doing chores for people when there's an extremely likable protagonist that needs saving. Whether you choose to complete the side quests or not, you still have to deal with the mandatory story filler in this chapter. So, the party decides to revisit Don Corneo and get him to spill the beans on how to infiltrate Shinra. What they find at his palace instead is his top bodyguard, Leslie, asking for your help in exchange for him providing a way to reach topside to get to Shinra. The task? Going into the sewers to kill Don Corneo because Don Corneo once made Leslie's fiance disappear or something? Oh, who cares? What follows is another trek through the sewers, except it actually is rather irritating because you've done all this stuff before already. You even fight the same boss at the end again as the last time you were trapped in the sewers. To make a needlessly long story short, Don Corneo escapes, but Leslie still honors your agreement and gives you grappling hooks to use for getting out of the slums with ease. Finally armed with the tools they need, Cloud, Tifa, and Barrett properly begin their journey to Shinra headquarters. Chapter 15 is easily the shortest chapter in terms of significant plot details. It exclusively shows the team scaling the walls in order to reach Shinra HQ safely. The cool thing about it is that it's one of the filler sections that doesn't feel like filler. The combat encounters in this chapter are very enjoyable, contain some breathtaking vistas of Midgar, and end with a banger of a boss fight. It's good stuff. The party makes it to Shinra HQ and fights their way inside. After taking in the sight of Shinra HQ's overwhelming immensity, they start exploring the place to get an idea of where Aerith is and how to reach her. Their exploration leads them to a guided tour of Shinra and the history of Midgar itself. It includes one really cool scene where the long past history of the ancients is visualized for the party in standard eye-wateringly pretty Square Enix graphics. For some reason, the tour decided to include a fucked up visual where Cloud witnesses the death of his friends and the destruction of all life as we know it, thanks to the big bad silver-haired swordsman Sephiroth. I don't know, weird choice for the tour. But that's not the last we see of Sephiroth in this moment. Later, he's seen just casually walking through the halls of Shinra and freaking out a wandering Palmer. Sephiroth really gives no fucks at this point in the story. After the team finishes the tour from hell, a mysterious man approaches them and leads them to a secret room where the mayor of Midgar stays. He reveals himself to be a secret Avalanche agent and instructs the team to locate another Avalanche secret agent so they're granted further access to the building. This is where the other already memed to hell and back part is.
What will it be for you today?
The mayor.
Mayo? Sorry, we don't have any here.
The mayor.
Huh? What about the mayor?
Never mind.
They finally manage to find the operative, and as luck would have it, also overhear that Shinra is about to have a super important boardroom meeting. Naturally, they decide to snoop in on it to see if they can gather some more intel. During this meeting is where we get our first extensive appearance of secondary antagonist, Professor Hojo. I don't want to list every specific reason why I hate him in this analysis because we'll be here all goddamn day, But this piece of shit is so deplorable and slimy that he makes Sephiroth look like a decent person by comparison. And Sephiroth wants to wipe out the fucking planet. Because Hojo mentions that he's been studying Aerith, Cloud decides the best course of action is to follow him to his lab. When they arrive there, they find Hojo and force him to take them to Aerith. But Hojo gets the upper hand by pitting his lab experiments and Shinra soldiers against the party. Although Cloud and the team successfully fight them off, Hojo escapes. On the brighter side, they reunite with Aerith, and we're finally introduced to one of the other big protagonists and party members of Final Fantasy VII, Red 13.
A fascinating question.
Did it just talk?
You asked what it is. I am that which you see before you. Nothing more. I'd appreciate it if we simply left it at that. Agreed?
Before they can go after Hojo, Cloud has another one of his pesky hallucinatory freakouts. Instead of seeing Sephiroth, he sees a vision of a weird alien creature kept in a holding cell. This causes him to utter the word mother and pass out. Cloud wakes up to find himself in Aerith's childhood room. After briefly getting an idea of where they are and their next course of action, Aerith confirms to the team herself that she is a descendant of the Ancients, or the Cetra as they're actually called. This scene is also where we finally get an idea of what the Whispers actually are. Remember those guys? As Red 13 puts it, they are harbingers of fate that keep the flow of destiny on track. In other words, if a big moment occurred in the original game, the Whispers appear to make sure it happens in Remake. So, do you remember that scene I asked you to keep in mind from way the hell back in Chapter 3? The one where Barrett told Cloud they wouldn't need him for the next bombing mission? Yeah, that one. Glad you remembered. Because not having Cloud on the next bombing mission would be a dramatic plot change in Remake, and more than likely not cause the events of the game to happen. The Whispers swarmed the slums and injured Jessie just to make sure Cloud would replace her for the mission. There are multiple examples of this happening throughout the game. Cloud not being able to kill Reno, Aerith being saved in the church, the party being dragged out of the secret Shinra lab, etc. And it's going to continue to happen from here on out. So I'm going to hold on to my thoughts on this particular plot revelation until later, but this moment represents one of the major tipping points for a lot of players. I said this change has proven to be divisive among the fan base, and I totally get why. If you ignored some of the worrying pre-release comments made by people like Nomura and Kitase, Square Enix sold this game as a straight-up remake of the events of Final Fantasy VII. Sure, there were going to be many additions in order to pad out the length, but no one figured they would go this far in changing the very nature of what the remake would be. With that established, the team discover that Wedge is in the building, and he warns them that because Avalanche is attacking the building, Shinra HQ has been placed on high alert. The party is instructed to get out of Hojo's lab and find a way to the roof in order to be extracted by a helicopter. Before the team can escape the lab, Sephiroth appears once more. This time around, the party can actually see him, and he tosses Cloud into the depths below.
A touching reunion.
This is unfortunately where we get our final stretch of bland, tedious, obnoxious, pacing-killing filler. Maybe even more so than the utterly useless Chapter 6. This good hour of the game where they have to escape from Hojo's lab is so boring that it puts a big bruise on what otherwise would be a delicious, juicy apple of a chapter. I get the reasoning behind making Final Fantasy VII Remake this damn long, but like I said earlier, Square Enix put themselves in this situation. I feel fully justified in complaining about the filler content feeling like shitty filler content, but this particular spot, oh god, it's so boring. Even the boss fight at the end of this Hojo's Lab nonsense is one of the few I'm not super crazy about. The too long didn't read version, the escape from Hojo's Lab is some big stinky doo-doo, and thank God that's the end of that. The team make their way to President Shinra's office and find him holding on for dear life on the balcony outside. Barrett rescues him, but because Shinra is a giant asshole, he repays the favor by pointing a gun at him. However, before Shinra can kill Barrett, Sephiroth appears and kills the president. For good measure, he also stabs and kills Barrett, and then summons a giant Lovecraftian monster for you to fight. This Genova Dreamweaver is a kick-ass boss fight and features one of the very best boss tunes in the game. For a while, I was actually convinced this was going to be the final boss of the game, considering how lengthy it is. In fact, there are a fair few fights during this finale that could easily be the final boss fights of any other game and be satisfying. But in the world of Final Fantasy VII Remake, they're mere stepping stones to the grand Mac Daddy of this game's boss fights in the final chapter. After defeating the Dreamweaver, Sephiroth flies away, but before Cloud can chase after him, the Whispers resurrect Barrett, because he didn't die during this part in the original game, so it would be against the fixed flow of destiny for him to die here. Cloud also witnesses Sephiroth, or someone possessed by Sephiroth, jump off the Shinra building into the depths below. Thankfully, the avalanche helicopter that Wedge mentions arrives to extract them. But the goddamn Turks arrive and blow it up. During this moment is where we're introduced to another important character, Rufus Shinra. That's right, the president's son. He and Cloud engage in a fucking fantastic anime-style boss fight that Nomura probably wet dreamed of constantly while designing it. Seriously, I know me gushing over these boss fights is getting routine at this point, but I really cannot stress enough how much the game nailed the vast majority of its boss fights. Cloud defeats Rufus and reunites with Tifa when she comes back to rescue him from getting killed by the Turks' helicopter. We then get a brief scene of Wedge inside the building. Because there are now constant things happening that might disrupt the timeline, the Whisperers have an even greater presence than before and attack Wedge on sight. We don't see it, but he's presumably thrown out a window and killed. Why? Well, for no other reason than Wedge was supposed to have died during the plate drop scene, so the Whisperers needed to fix that mistake. Rest in peace, Wedge. While this is going on, Barrett, Aerith, and Red 13 encounter a different boss, the Arsenal. While the Rufus fight is awesome, this one is not. It's decent, but it gets kind of old after a while. It doesn't have the same dynamic energy of the Rufus fight, and considering how close the two are in the events of the story, the contrast in quality is immediately apparent and kind of distracting. The trio destroy the robot and go back to the Shinra entry point. Heidegger and his team ambush them. Before they can be killed, Cloud arrives on his iconic motorcycle and wipes out the soldiers. It's a gloriously stupid moment that works because it's a giant payoff for all the crap Shinra has put us through throughout this entire game. Tifa also arrives in her less cool vehicle, and the team hop aboard. The famous shot of Cloud busting out of the Shinra building on the motorcycle is recreated, and the team hit the highway to make their escape. And where will this lead them? Well...
It's finally time. It's time to finally talk about Chapter 18. Oh man, I have been looking forward to this the whole time. I've been waiting. I've been eagerly awaiting talking about Chapter 18 for 5 months now, or however long it's going to be until this video comes out. So, for a little while, before and after the game had come out, I had heard from a few people that the ending to the game was divisive, to say the very least. I had actually seen a few comments on my early impressions of Final Fantasy VII Remake that things like that they dropped the ball with the ending, that someone couldn't wait for my angry rant on it, that they thought it was just bad, how Nomura and his writing team screwed up. And I was a little nervous going into the final chapter thinking, oh god, I hope this is not... I hope this isn't the complete convoluted shit show that I'd heard from people that it was. Because all I had to hear was Nomura dropped the ball, or Nomura couldn't help himself. And I just imagined the worst case scenario. I imagined something like the lore to Kingdom Hearts Unchained or something, because that shit is just a mess. And I hate to disappoint some of you out there who were expecting me to just go on a tirade against this ending, but the truth of the matter is, I actually really loved the final chapter of Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I would go even a step further and use a word that I hardly ever use on this channel. I think the final chapter of Final Fantasy VII Remake is genius. I don't know what 2020 video game opinion of mine is more controversial. The fact that I adored The Last of Us Part 2 and think it's better than the first one, or the fact that I think the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake is genius. So there you have it. I think the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake is brilliant, and it really goes to show when Nomura is in his element, when he's in his groove, it goes to show how much of a master storyteller he can actually be.
While escaping down the highway, the team noticed that the Whispers have swarmed around the Shinra HQ building like an army of angry hornets. It's simultaneously one of the most beautiful and haunting sights in the game, watching these spectral beings completely surround this titanic building. The party doesn't get much time to take in the sight, because Rufus Shinra makes the call to have them captured and returned to HQ. Cloud has to contend with a plethora of soldiers and drones attacking him while protecting Tifa's vehicle as she escorts the others to safety. Even after defeating all of those enemies, a giant robot bursts onto the scene like the Kool-Aid Man for the game's second big vehicle boss fight. Cloud destroys it, and the party makes their way to the literal end of the road, where they encounter Sephiroth once more. Before the group can attack him, Aerith stops them and starts staring Sephiroth down, while saying that everything about him is wrong. Sephiroth replies by whipping the Whispers into a frenzy as they leave the Shinra building and swarm around the party and Sephiroth. Not only that, the Whispers are so thoroughly disturbed that they cry out, and it triggers a really surprising hallucination. This is where we're treated to our first glimpse of a character I was 100% sure we weren't going to see. The one and only Zack Fair. I know it says at the very beginning of this analysis that there will be full spoilers for the original Final Fantasy VII, but I'm going to avoid talking about his backstory and the role he plays in that game. If you know who Zack is, great. If you don't, well, go play the original game, or Crisis Core. We're shown a recreation of the beginning of his iconic death scene from Crisis Core. Sporting a new voice actor and some slightly altered lines, he charges into battle as the scene cuts back to the present. I think this scene is something only the player and Aerith can see, and a clear sign that Square Enix made good on their promise to bring other elements from the Final Fantasy VII compilation universe into this remake. Once the vision ends, Sephiroth cuts a portal open and goads Cloud to follow him through it. This moment with Sephiroth convinced me of something that Remake subtly hints at throughout the game. This isn't the Sephiroth from the original Final Fantasy VII timeline. What this game heavily implies is that this Sephiroth is the version of himself that has lived through and survived the events of the original Final Fantasy VII and Advent Children. And hell, I'm even willing to bet this Sephiroth is the same one we've seen in the first two mainline Kingdom Hearts games. Yes, the very same one that Sora fights in Hollow Bastion and Olympus Coliseum. The Sephiroth we see before us is the one that has traveled through time and or another dimension to come to the remake timeline. And Aerith knows this, or at least I'm 95% sure she knows this. I think that's why she remarks that everything about him is wrong when she lays eyes on him. This is the most experienced and dangerous version of Sephiroth we've seen in the Square Enix universe. Once Sephiroth disappears through this portal, Cloud attempts to follow him, but is held back by Aerith. She ominously states that this is the point of no return, and creates her own much brighter portal through Sephiroth's. In one of the coolest scenes in the game that I wish I could just let it run through in its entirety, Aerith explains that the portal she created leads to a fight against Destiny itself. She says that by defeating whatever Destiny can throw at them, they will successfully break away from the events of the original Final Fantasy VII and be able to forge an unknown future. I haven't really touched on the music a whole lot during this analysis, but this scene where Aerith hypes up the party to go after the Whispers and Sephiroth is backed by a really amazing new arrangement of the beginning of the bombing mission theme. It gives me goosebumps every time I hear it and sets the stage perfectly for the final battle ahead. This scene also marked a giant turning point for me, where I went from really liking this game to flat out loving it. When I realized what Nomura and his team were going for and what it represented, I was floored by its ambition and creativity. Look, I knew Remake was going to change things around. It had to. There is no way they could have remade the first 5 hours of OG FF7 and translate them into a satisfying and sensical 3-act structure. It's not possible. However, I was not prepared to see Nomura and his team taking the core idea of remaking Final Fantasy VII and translating those struggles into the narrative of the game itself for the player to act out through the characters. The player is forced to play an active role in remaking Final Fantasy VII in order to create an unknown future free of the confines of the past. That's brilliant! With this in mind, the Whispers could represent a few things. One interpretation is really clever, the other one is really clever and really fucking arrogant on Square Enix's part. The non-arrogant interpretation is that they embody the internal struggle the developers must have had to contend with when it came to faithfully preserving everything that happened in the original game, and the idea of changing some of it. It's a dilemma that I'm sure every developer who works on updating or remaking a classic has to face, because you can't please everyone. That's just a fact of life. The really arrogant interpretation is that the Whispers represent the literal whiny FF7 purists who complain about every single little change to their beloved game. And the creatures going apeshit at the end is Square Enix's acknowledgement that a bunch of fans are going to loathe the changes that are about to come. Again, I don't know which interpretation Square Enix had in mind when developing this, but I kind of love how ballsy that second one is. It's almost just a giant fuck you to the Final Fantasy VII purists, and I love it. I'll be honest, I love it. It's Square Enix giving themselves literal narrative justification to do whatever the hell they want in the future, and not have to worry about preserving the original game's story. I can't imagine any other big AAA publisher going this far in literally breaking a game's story for the remake and letting the player experience it and carry it out for themselves. As arrogant and potentially cowardly as it is, I have to give Square Enix props for being just that out there with this idea. Now, I obviously don't know if this storytelling risk is going to have a big payoff in the future, But what I do know is that it floored me when I realized what was about to happen. It's such a clever, genius creation of a meta-narrative, and this is what Nomura's storytelling strength is. Aside from the original 3 Kingdom Hearts games, he's not good at creating convoluted, lore-heavy narratives that juggle multiple side stories and mysteries. As evidenced by the latter-day Kingdom Hearts games, he can be a really sloppy and poor storyteller when he's outside of his element. But meta-narratives? That's something he has a seriously strong knack for. For those who have been wondering why I dedicated a portion of the prologue to Tetsuo Nomura and Kingdom Hearts, it's because I'm about to positively compare Final Fantasy VII Remake to what I consider to be the holy grail of video games, Kingdom Hearts 2. The notoriously misunderstood and unfairly derided prologue featuring Roxas and the usual Spot Gang is what I consider to be the storytelling peak of the series. It's one giant meta-narrative about waiting for Kingdom Hearts 2, and the changes and growth its audience went through in their personal lives since the first game. Roxas' ever-increasing disillusionment and disconnection from his friends and reality represents how one can feel when they're transitioning from childhood into young adulthood. This all culminates with sacrificing Roxas to a sad and unknown fate in favor of returning to play as Sora, thus completing the transition we all face from innocence into a much scarier world. It's great! This Roxas prologue is what got me hooked on the series, and I think it's proof of Nomura's creative genius when he's in his element. It's also not the only time a meta-narrative has come into play in the Kingdom Hearts series. My favorite scene in Kingdom Hearts 3 has Sora literally calling upon the power of the Kingdom Hearts community in order to defeat an extremely powerful swarm of Heartless. It's a deeply moving scene, and further proof that when he's not dealing with convoluted nonsense, Nomura has it in him to create some of the most amazing, overwhelming sequences in video game history. The man is a genius. So armed with their new knowledge, Cloud and the team walk into the Portal of Light to face the Whispers. The creatures pull a polymerization and fuse together to form the Whisper Harbinger, a gigantic monster capable of crushing the party and the environment around it. It also summons 3 Whisper monsters that act as its proxy to fight the party. A significant yet completely missable detail is that these 3 Whispers potentially reflect the movesets of Advent Children's trio of antagonists Kadaj, Laz, and Yazoo. If that's true, and Square Enix has neither confirmed nor denied this, then it's a cool little story bit of the remnants of Sephiroth fighting against being retconned out of existence. I don't know, I just think nutty little fan theories like that are really cool. Another significant yet completely unmissable detail is that every time you take a decent chunk off the Whisper Harbinger's health, it bleeds light, and that light enters the minds of the party. When it does, they're treated to a vision of an event to come later in the original timeline. For example, we see the opening scene of Advent Children with Red 13, Cloud and Sephiroth fighting, and even Cloud giving Aerith her underwater burial. These visions are explained to be the events to come should they fail to stop the Whisper Harbinger, and that gives the party more resolve to defeat it. As for the boss fight itself, it's pretty good. Despite the multiple unskippable cutscenes and lack of checkpoints, it's another one of this game's big boss fights that could have been the final boss. It certainly feels like it, considering you're fighting against the embodiment of destiny, and the sweeping, hopeful music gives you the feeling of fighting and, near the end, winning against overwhelming odds. After a long, multi-stage battle, the Whisper Harbinger is defeated, and the party are teleported to a bright, white place. And here at last, the party comes face to face with the true final boss of the game. The one, the only, Sephiroth.
I'm waiting, Cloud.
What the hell is this?
This is... Sephiroth.
Going into this remake, one of the big questions I had was, how are they going to have Sephiroth as the final battle? We all knew he was going to be the final boss. There is no way Square Enix would remake any part of Final Fantasy VII without having arguably the most iconic villain in the series be the final fight. But they miraculously found a way to reasonably justify his prominent role in the finale. At this point, we aren't just fighting against Sephiroth. Within the context of the story, we are fighting against the last drop of the power of the Whispers that Sephiroth has absorbed into himself. This final fight is against the chains of the past in the form of a very familiar villain. Again, this is just so damn clever and inventive that it frustrates me that so many people are quick to dismiss it as pretentious garbage. But back to the Sephiroth fight. For reasons that should be very obvious, this was the fight I was looking forward to the most. Since I'm such a fan of Advent Children's insane spectacle, I was hoping Remake would translate this crazy end fight between Cloud and Sephiroth into something playable. And I gotta say, this fight succeeded my expectations. I think everything about it is nearly perfect. It looks and plays like an intense boss fight from the golden era of JRPGs, but transitioned into the modern era of graphics and gameplay. It's a challenging fight that really pushes you to utilize the combat system to its absolute best and fullest potential. All of the skills and little tricks you've learned over the course of the game must now be used to win this Sephiroth fight. I don't think Remake is a necessarily difficult game, but this boss fight does an amazing job of making you feel like you're surviving by the skin of your teeth. Sephiroth is just not fucking around here. It's a modern looking boss battle with the beating heart of a classic JRPG. I really didn't think they could accomplish that, but they did. One of Nomura's biggest strengths is also given the spotlight: large scale spectacle. Nomura is a stylist. He knows how to design and structure epic set pieces, and how to nail the micro and macro character moments within them. And the Sephiroth fight is one hell of an epic set piece. Everything from the incredible background details, to Sephiroth's moveset, to the phase transitions are beautifully animated and flow almost seamlessly together. I love how the environment becomes more unstable and apocalyptic as the fight progresses. I love how Cloud is alone against Sephiroth during his first phase, but for each phase you survive, a party member joins the fight in a badass way. It's so great. One of my favorite moments is when Aerith joins the battle after the first phase, and she says one of the coolest fucking things ever.
Did you miss me?
Not really. He's tough.
Yeah, so what? Screw him.
Just so good. But the gigantic, delicious cherry on top is the glorious new arrangement of the legendary One-Winged Angel. Without it, this fight wouldn't be half as good as it is. Actually, more than the cherry on top, this is the key ingredient to what makes this fight so damn incredible. It starts out with a different kind of rhythm when you're fighting one-on-one against Sephiroth at the beginning, but with the second phase, it becomes more intense, and it inches closer to the original theme you remember. Finally, when all three party members have arrived to fight, the classic melody kicks into high gear, and you're absorbed into the heat of battle as one of the greatest boss themes ever pounds away. My favorite part is when we finally reach Sephiroth's final phase, and the melody becomes even faster and more intense, and it's synced up perfectly to Cloud's transition animations. When I experienced this moment for the first time, it gave me this indescribable feeling of, oh my god, this is it. I've made it this far. Just a few more steps and I can win. I can do this. It gave me this massive feeling of elation and excitement and anticipation and chills when I saw Sephiroth summon Meteor and give a menacing stare to the party as he goes into berserk mode. Combined with the gorgeous music and the fact that Sephiroth now has moves that can wipe out the party easily, I lost all sense of time and space when I first played this, and my brain just simply focused on what I needed to do. Defeat Sephiroth. Finally, and I do mean finally, after reducing the bastard's health to 0, you're treated to one of the greatest endings to a boss fight I've ever seen. I'm not even gonna talk over this. Roll it!
Welcome back. We can do this. We can. We can change it. Make it right. Cloud! Quickly!
I mean, wow. If any of you have ever wondered what I consider perfection to look like in a video game, that's it. Right there. That scene is perfect. Every aspect of it fires on all cylinders. There's not a frame of it that's out of place, or a noticeable flaw anywhere to be found. Per-fucking-fection. It's the final push against not only the final boss, but it's the reassuring call to arms to fight against destiny and fight for a better tomorrow. It never fails to give me that incredible warm fuzzy feeling in me. After Cloud delivers the seemingly final blow, Sephiroth teleports them to a bizarre new place called the Edge of Creation. If there was one aspect of the finale that kind of made me roll my eyes a little bit and go, okay, Nomura, it's here. Just that name, the Edge of Creation, it's a very Tetsuro Nomura thing. Sephiroth tells Cloud that because of their actions, the future is now completely unknown, and they're free to do whatever they want. He asks Cloud to join him, but Cloud refuses. They engage in a really cool one-on-one fight, but Sephiroth defeats Cloud easily. With the knowledge that now Sephiroth is free to kill anyone he sees fit, the realization of what Cloud and the party have done finally washes over him. This was Sephiroth's plan all along. He wanted Cloud to literally remake Final Fantasy VII and break free of the canon confines in order to give him a shot of winning in this timeline. It's a strange situation because, in a way, our heroes lose. They unknowingly accomplish the villain's goals, even though now they are free to create a future where, say, Aerith lives. They've also created a future where Sephiroth could potentially summon something worse than Meteor and wipe out literally every single little thing in existence in the galaxy. And Sephiroth lets Cloud live just to remind him of this. Before he disappears, our villain leaves Cloud with an ominous warning and clue that could help him in a future game. After this, we see two scenes within Shinra HQ. Rufus becoming the new president, and Hojo laughing maniacally at Sephiroth destroying his lab. But we're also given a glimpse of some unintended side effects of Destiny being wiped away in place of a new and unknown future. Back in the flashback timeline, Zack wins the fight against the Shinra soldiers and doesn't die. Cloud and the party's actions in this game have created a new alternate timeline where Zack survives, and I know for sure this is going to get expanded upon in future games. Switching back to this game's timeline, it's revealed that Biggs is alive. Like Zack, he has been given a second chance to live. Finally, Marlene is seen in Elmira's house, and she senses that Barrett is attempting to reach out to her to no avail. The party resolves to hunt Sephiroth down and stop him. Before our game ends, we're treated to one final moment of the current and alternate timelines briefly intersecting in spirit as Zack carries a badly injured Cloud away to Midgar. Sensing their presence, Aerith looks up and says,
I miss it. The steel sky.
As a new song by Nobuo Uematsu plays, we're given a very MCU-esque title card that reads, "The unknown journey will continue." And yeah, that's it. That concludes Final Fantasy VII Remake.
Shining brightly, your smiling face to guide my way.
So, now the big question is, where do we go from here? Square Enix have just obliterated any narrative confines they would have needed to adhere to in future games, and that gives them complete creative freedom to do whatever the hell they want. Personally, it's very exciting and worrying. It's exciting because Nomura and the writers are now free to go to some crazy places and maybe play around some more with those meta-narratives I love so much. It's worrying because Nomura and the writers could derail this train and crash into a territory that turns the series into insufferable gibberish. The big thing that greatly worries me is how they're going to handle the death of Aerith in future titles. It's one of the most iconic scenes in the entire franchise, and a key element as to what makes Final Fantasy VII so memorable and special to a lot of people. Even with this narrative justification they've given themselves, I have suspicions that Square Enix are going to fuck around with it. And I'm not 100% sure how to feel about that now. Like I said earlier, them destroying the timeline confines for this remake is a potentially cowardly move, because now they don't have to recreate the really sad and tragic moments from the original game. So, as far as what's going to happen in future titles, it's really up in the air at this point. But I have both a lot of hope and a lot of concern for the future. As for this first part of Final Fantasy VII Remake, I really like it. It's kind of a miracle how good it is. I'm so used to these white whales of the video game industry coming out and really disappointing me and the fans. So it's miraculous that I think Remake is really damn good. Again, it's not exactly a high bar to leap over, but I think Remake is the best single-player Final Fantasy game in almost 20 years. Easily. Hands down it is. For a very long time, I was convinced Final Fantasy as a franchise had abandoned me. I thought Square Enix had moved on from focusing on terrific characters and storytelling when it came to this franchise, in order to chase the apex of pretty graphics. Terrific characters and storytelling is why I fell in love with this franchise, and with JRPGs, and with video games as a whole back in the day. So to see them abandon that in favor of amazing spectacle and graphics without any heart just disappointed me and made me sad for so many years. But they finally recaptured that lost soul. They finally did it. Now I remember what it feels like to play an immensely satisfying Final Fantasy game. This game is part of the 1-2-3 punch of recent Square Enix titles that have made me feel like a 7-year-old sitting in front of his PlayStation 2 again. And with the recent announcement of Final Fantasy XVI, Remake has allowed me to be excited for the future of this franchise again. I thought Final Fantasy XV was going to be the savior of the franchise, but we all know how that turned out. With Remake, I've now given myself permission to be hopeful for Final Fantasy again. And that's just an amazing gift that Square Enix has given me. Even with the blemishes that it has, Final Fantasy VII Remake is one special game to me.